Hi everyone, and welcome to this introductory video on the cognitive approach. So before we get started, you will need your booklet in front of you, and we're on page 15 in your approaches booklet. You see at the moment I've got the specification loaded up as we did with the learning approaches, just to give you an overview of what it's going to involve. So this approach, cognitive approach, as you will have discovered as part of your introductory tasks, is all to do with information processing. And this idea that we deal with lots and lots of sensory information, and the cognitive approach looks at how we actually process all of that information. Okay, so this is a little bit of an overview. I would say before we get started that it's probably a good idea to have a highlighter available to you as well, same as what we did with the learning approach. Okay, so if you're ready, let's get started. So key assumptions is the first thing that we've got to go through, as we do with all of the approaches. These are very, very common exam questions, so get familiar with knowing what your key assumptions are, because they appear on every single applied general paper that we've seen. So if you remember from my previous introductory video lesson, from the behaviourist approach, a key assumption is a shared set of beliefs or assumptions from a particular group of psychologists who work within a particular field. So with the cognitive approach, you can see on the screen at the moment, they originated in the kind of late 1950s and the early 1960s. And they decided as a key assumption of the cognitive approach that they were going to focus on studying mental, or to give its correct terminology, mediational processes, but they were going to try and do that in a scientific way. So the word cognitive means conscious intellectual activity, and that's what the cognitive approach is all about. So the assumption that underpins it is to investigate internal mental processing. So we've got two key assumptions that we need you to learn for the case of the exam. Key assumption number one, you can see on page 16, if you just want to highlight this with me, is that cognitive psychologists propose that behaviour is a product of information processing. So that's the first of our kind of key terms for this lesson. And then what I'd like you to do is just have a read through the paragraph that's on the screen at the moment. It's exactly the same as what's in your booklet. And just pause for a second here and see if you can put the gaps at the bottom of the screen into the gaps that are in that paragraph. So just take a moment and see if you can figure out which way round they go. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to just kind of skim read that paragraph and had a go at matching the key terms. So if you want to now fill in the keywords with me as I've got them on the screen. So in accordance with this first key assumption, that cognitive psychologists believe that all behaviour is a product of information processing. They believe that humans process the information that they receive from their environment, and that we don't, if you want to highlight this for me, we don't just passively respond to stimuli. So if you remember from social learning theory and classical and operant conditioning, learning theorists would argue that almost automatically we respond to things that we encounter in our life. The cognitive approach would argue that we process those encounters, we process all stimuli. So everything that we receive from our environment, we think about it or we process it in some way. We don't just respond automatically or passively. They also believe that behaviour is best understood in terms of flowing through a number of cognitive systems, and this includes kind of memory. So that brings us to the next bullet point down. So the mind's cognitions include attention, which is what we do with the things around us. So attention to bring information in from the external environment. We then send it to the working memory. So we pay attention to something in our environment. We send it to our working memory, where we will manipulate or change the information that is available to us, i.e. we do something with it. And then the long-term memory is used to hold information for infinite periods of time until we need to retrieve it back. So following on from this paragraph outlining the information processing assumption, we also utilise this diagram. So it's quite a common diagram which is used to basically outline or illustrate rather information processing. So based on the paragraph that you've just filled in on page 16, why don't you now have a go at filling in these three terms on my screen into the relevant places. So we've got the arrow and we've got the two boxes. So just take a second, based exactly on the paragraph above, do you think you can now complete what goes into those three spaces? Okay, so hopefully you've been able to fill that in. So sensory memory, so stimulus information, we must pay attention to it. If we don't pay attention to things in our environment, then it disappears within about 2 to 3 seconds, some of it much, much faster. So once we pay attention, it goes into our working memory, and working memory can hold somewhere between 5 and 9 items, and it lasts for about 20 seconds, but you have to do something with that information. If you do something with that information, then we encode it into our long-term memory. And then obviously when we need that information, we go through the process of retrieval. So that's what we call the information processing model. And that's key assumption number 1. All behaviour is based on information processing. If we turn it over onto page 17, the second key assumption is this idea that in order to best explain human behaviour, we can compare the mind to a computer. So this is called the computer analogy. Again, if you want to highlight that term, that's a really important piece of terminology. So what this assumption states is the brain, or the mind, you can use both terms interchangeably, is a central processing unit and codes or changes information from one format to another. So for example, you might change visual information to verbal information in your memory. So you might see a picture, but then rather than remembering the picture, you recall a set of words for it. Or it can go the other way, okay? The brain receives information, which is referred to as the input. It manipulates and changes that information and stores it, which is the processes taking place. And then we respond to the environment, which is the output. And as I said, we use this kind of general idea in cognitive psychology to help us explain or understand that the brain pretty much works in the same way that a computer does. So if we take an average kind of like information processing situation for humans and we apply the computer terminology, you should be able to put these statements in an order. So we'll do this together because sometimes this can be a little bit confusing. But where we'd start, and if you want to add your numbers in, is that the eyes receive some visual information. So as a starting point, that would be some sort of input. So if you imagine a computer, that would be typing in to the computer. Then what would happen is that the information is fed back to the brain. So in humans, we receive the information, it gets stored within our brain or it gets processed by our brain. If we were on a computer, then it's going to the central processing unit. Okay, so the hardware is doing something with that typed information. It's coded or it's stored, it's dealt with in some way. Again, when we're dealing with information as humans, other parts of the brain relating to the mental activities that are taking place use that information. So if we've got a bit of visual or auditory information, our brain is processing it, but we might have to think about the information that we've received. If we're talking about a computer, then some sort of software is processing the information that's being given to you, and you might have to download that software. And then what we get as an output is some sort of behavioural consequence or some sort of outcome that you can see. So reading what can be seen on a page is the human outcome. For a computer, it might be printing a document of some sort or saving it somewhere. So we use this kind of computer analogy a lot in cognitive psychology. So they are your two key assumptions. Now, before we move away from the key assumptions, I do just want to say that we're going to skip over a couple of pages in your booklet because your teacher will go through the features of memory with you in class because it's quite lengthy. So I don't want to go through that bit with you. So if you want to jump forward in your booklets, guys, for me to page 21 at this stage. Okay. And on page 21, what you will see is a QR code. So what I would like you to do now is I'd like you to pause this video in a second when you're ready, and I want you to scan that QR code and watch that video. It's about 4.5 minutes long, and I'd like you to note down some important information that you think you get out of that video. So go ahead and pause this video now, and then we'll come back and we'll see kind of what you've got written down. Okay? Okay, so hopefully if you now just have a look over what you've written into that space in your booklet, these are some of the things that you should have picked up on. If you didn't pick up on them, it might be an idea to write some of these things in now because these will be tested in your lesson with your teacher. So what you should have found out from that video is that retrieval, or the process of retrieval, as I've already said in the key assumptions, is the act of bringing information back from your long-term memory into your working memory. And that can be a whole host of things that are stored in long-term memory, including facts, dates, directions, faces, places, stuff that you need to know for exams. It's anything that is in your long-term memory, but retrieval is the act of getting it out of long-term memory and back into your working memory where you process it or do something with it. And when we go through retrieval, there are 3 different types of retrieval that can take place. We have free recall, cued recall, and recognition. So firstly, we have free recall, which is where you are shown some information or some stimuli, and then retrieving it, you are doing it without any cues at all, okay? So it's not learnt in any particular way, it's just random bits of information, and you're recalling it in a random way without any cues. Now, when we tend to retrieve in this manner, we tend to recall the first and last items that we've been exposed to better, and we lose the things in the middle. This tends to be because we pay more attention to the first few items, if it's like a word list or something, and then the last items are kind of still in your working memory. So this is known as the serial position curve, and you will have seen the little kind of illustration of it in that video clip. So the serial position curve is the tendency to recall the first and last items that you've been exposed to, but not the middle ones. If we use a bit more terminology, the tendency to recall the first items is known as the primacy effect, so prime being first. The tendency to recall the last items is the recency effect, i.e. it's the most recent information that you were exposed to, so that's why you recall it. So that's free recall. Cued recall is reproducing information but with a little bit of help from what we call retrieval cues. So the retrieval cues can come in a number of forms. It could be imagery, it could be somebody posing a question to you like what you would get in a classroom, or it might be kind of word blanks where you give somebody, like I've said in my example, the first couple of letters and then you have to figure out the rest of the word. So cued recall tends to be used a lot in classrooms where you get a little bit of a leg up, a little bit of a cue to help you along the way, and then that should hopefully kind of prompt a response from your long-term memory. You retrieve that information. The last type of retrieval is called recognition, which is where you have exposed learners to a stimuli, maybe some new, maybe some old, and you ask them to identify which stimuli they have already seen. So it's the act of recognizing which bit of information they have seen previously. So I'm going to give you some examples here of recognition. So we're on page 21 still now. We're dropping down to the middle portion of the booklet. So recognition memory, as I've said on the previous slide, is the ability to recognise previously encountered information, objects, people, places, facts, etc., etc. So when you previously experience information and it's re-experienced, it gets matched to what you've already stored. So the example of recognition from the video clip that you've just watched is being able to recognise the word fork because you were already shown it earlier in the video. Okay, so because you've seen it before, then when you're asked, do you recognise either of these bits of information, your brain automatically says, I've seen that one before, it's matched up with what you're currently experiencing, and you can recognise it. So we got some more examples of recognition here, which you can pop into your boxes. So recognising that someone's had a haircut because you already know their face and you can see the difference in them. Recognising a particular street sign that's on your route home. Again, what you're experiencing now gets matched up with what you've experienced before. Or what we all kind of experience on a daily basis is recognising names or faces that you might have seen in the news or in the media. So they're my 3 examples. I'd love it if you could just pause this video here again and just take a moment to see if you could come up with any more of your own, and then when we feed back in class you can tell your teachers or other students in the class what other examples you came up with. So pause this here, take a moment, see if you can come up with some more examples of recognition. Okay. Right, so at this point we're going to do a little jump again, because you'll see on page 22 that there are some tasks that your teacher is going to do with you in lesson to check that you've remembered this stuff on recognition and recall. Okay, so we're going to jump over page 22. So if you want to go now to page 23, and we're going to build a little bit more now on what we refer to as retrieval cues. So when we're using cued recall, there are different types of cue which can prompt memory. So recall is remembering or retrieving something from your past in the physical absence of that thing. Okay, so you're no longer exposed to that particular stimuli, but you're able to remember it. You're able to retrieve that experience or that stimuli, that object, that name, that face, because you're no longer in the presence, but because you've been provided with a cue. So cues tend to fall into one of 2 headings. They can be either internal or external, and most of this is written in your booklet. So again, if you just want to highlight it. Internal cues refer to your physical or psychological state. So for example, your mood or feelings can act as a cue that help you retrieve memories. For example, when we are happy, we tend to recall other happy events or memories. Works all ways. If you're sad or you're frustrated or you're disappointed, you tend to recall other memories or events where you had the similar feelings. So internal cues are all kind of emotional or psychological. External cues are things. So these are things which might include words, sentences, pictures or parts of pictures, first letters. They relate in some way to the information that you have previously stored in your memory and that you're now trying to recall. So this is kind of what you use when you are revising for an exam. Okay, so specific words, sentences, first letters, etc., etc. Now, what we found in psychological research is that the most powerful form of cue is definitely internal cues. So we've given you another QR code to quite an interesting study conducted in 1969 by Goodwin, who looked at sobriety and how sobriety can aid recall, but also how consumption of alcohol can aid recall. So I'd like you to scan the QR code. Again, pause this video in a second. Note down what was involved in the research and also make a note of the findings. And it'd be really useful if you could copy out, just into that little box, it doesn't take much, the little results graph that goes with it. And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by the findings. So again, give it a quick pause and just note your findings and the procedures in there. Okay.